Hello, everyone. My name's Adam Rosen, and today we are going to be talking about behavioral-based interviewing. Before we get started, I just wanted to go over a few things. First off, I wanted to mention that we do have a worksheet that you can use and follow along during this whole meeting. I will also be asking you questions during the meeting and pausing for response, so feel free to write down your answers or to just say them out loud. Well, before we get started, I just wanted to introduce myself. My name again, Adam Rosen. I'm the founder and CEO of Radar Talent Solutions. We are a company that helps public school districts with their recruiting and hiring best practices. And today we're going to be talking about one of the most important factors when you're evaluating candidates, and that is the assessment process. And behavioral-based interviewing is one of the most important things you can do to ensure that candidates are fitting within your organization and that they're going to stay for a long time. So let's go ahead and get started. Let's start with the problem. School districts need to hire a lot of people, and they need to hire them quickly. And so how do we develop a consistent assessment process that ensures that candidates meet the core values of your organization? And that's going to come through behavioral-based interviewing. So I'm going to ask two different questions, and I'm going to pause in between them for you to respond. You can either respond out loud or you can write down your answer to this question. Either one works. The first question is, what would you do if you saw two students who got into a physical altercation? Go ahead and respond to that answer. My next question is, tell me about a time when you had to respond to two students who had a physical altercation. What was the situation? What were the things you had to think about? What were the results of that encounter? How would you do it differently next time? Those two questions illustrate the difference between hypothetical interviewing and behavioral-based interviewing. In a hypothetical interview, I give you a hypothetical question that you can answer any way you'd like. Usually, you might tell me what you want to hear. In a behavioral-based interview question, I'm going to ask a specific question about a specific instance that you had to handle, and then I'm going to ask follow-up questions. And the difference between these two is that in the behavioral-based interview question, I'm going to get down to the exact behavior I'm looking for and see if you handled that situation accordingly. And so behavioral-based interviewing is asking open-ended and follow-up questions to evaluate a candidate's behaviors. This gains insight into their future performance. It is much more predictive than hypothetical questions, and it is proven to be more effective in focusing on the experience. It focuses on the how instead of the what. So I don't necessarily care how many times the candidate has to split up a physical altercation between students. I'm concerned about how they did that. Behavioral-based interviewing is not asking hypothetical questions. Again, when we ask a hypothetical question, the candidate can respond in any way they want. It's not necessarily indicative of what they would do if they came into that situation. Behavioral-based interviewing does not only rely on someone's experience. Sometimes experience can be bad experience, or it might not match your organization's core values. So while experience can be indicative of certain success, we also need to make sure that the candidate has the behaviors they need for success. And another thing about behavioral-based interviewing is that there are multiple questions within one question. So when I asked that question before, I had about 4 follow-up questions. And I could even have more follow-up questions. And so one of the key differences in behavioral-based interviewing is you're going to ask fewer overall questions, but you're going to have much more of a discussion with the candidate on follow-up questions. So why is behavioral-based interviewing effective? Well, not everyone is a great interviewer. And behavioral-based interviewing gives everybody a chance to share all of their great things about them. And that we do that by asking follow-up questions. I usually start behavioral-based interviews by indicating that I'm going to be taking detailed notes. I usually also say that I'm looking for the STAR format: situation, task, action, and result. And I also give the candidate a chance to write down their answer prior to responding so that they can think through their answer. I then ask detailed follow-up questions based on their answer to make sure I'm eliciting everything out of them. And so behavioral-based interviewing will level that playing field for some candidates who might be nervous, who might not be great interviewers, or who might just be inexperienced. The second thing is that behavioral-based interviewing limits bias. Through this behavioral-based interviewing process, you're going to develop a very clear and consistent guideline for how to rate a candidate. We're not going to use much gut feeling. We're not going to use the idea of, do we want to have a beer with this candidate? It's going to be a much more scientific way of evaluating a candidate's performance. And the third thing about why it's effective is that it is going to find candidates who fit within your organization, who end up being happier, and who end up staying. And so in this slide, we have two reports, scientific reports, showing how behavioral-based interviewing is scientifically proven to be more effective and limit bias. Here are the steps to master behavioral-based interviewing. The first step is to outline your organization's core values. A core value is something that every single individual in your organization needs to exhibit in some manner. Some organizations have 3 core values, some have 15. As long as everybody knows what these core values are and they are practiced on a day-to-day basis, that is really what matters. The next thing is to develop a leveling guide. So everyone in the organization might need to exhibit those core values, but we might express them in different ways. For example, if one of our core values is to be student-focused, we might expect the superintendent to think about 3 to 5 year plans on how to improve student engagement. And we might look towards an entry-level childcare staff to provide age-appropriate activities to the students in their care. Those are both the same core value, but expressed in different ways. And a leveling guide will help us determine who the expectations for each level. The next thing we need to do is develop a question set related to your core values. This has actually become much easier with AI, and so I highly recommend using ChatGPT or another chat service to find questions that will ask candidates about those core values. The next thing we need to do is develop a grading rubric. And this rubric is going to be something that your team takes notes on during the interview, and we are going to use that for the whole interview process. And the fifth thing we need to do is practice. Behavioral-based interviewing is difficult to master, but once you master it, it's incredibly effective. Before we move on, let's go through the difference between a core value and a mission statement. Core values are the fundamental principles and beliefs that guide an organization's behavior, decision-making, and actions. They define your culture and priorities, and they act as a moral compass. And so let's use equity as an example here. A core value for equity could be treating all students fairly, regardless of background. Core values are different from a mission statement, which describes what an organization aims to accomplish. Organizations have one mission statement, but they have multiple core values. So let's move to our worksheet now. And in your worksheet, in the top part of that worksheet, there is a box where you can write down your organization's core values. If you need to look those up, that is fine. But go ahead and write down those core values and maybe highlight the most important ones. Great. After you've done that, I want you to go into your favorite AI assistant and type your core values and ask it to develop behavioral-based questions based on these core values. Once you've done that, take a look at those questions, and in the second box on your page, under your core values, write out your top 3 questions that you feel would help you with those core values. And so here's an example of how a core value can be turned into an interview question. If the core value is being a good teammate, and let's just understand what that means, that the teammate understands the importance of fostering positive relationships and communication with staff, parents, and children. An example of a question could be, describe a time when you disagreed with a teammate or coworker on how to accomplish a task or goal. How did you come to a resolution? How did this impact your relationship with the person going forward? Is there anything you would do differently next time? Let's move on to our leveling guides. A leveling guide takes your top behaviors and outlines the expectation by level. It looks at the scope, complexity, and the time horizons that each level is expected to operate at. I'm sharing here an example of one of Radar Talent Solutions' leveling guides, and this is specific to school-age care. And so we've determined that our most important behaviors are accountability, student focus, and adaptability. We've added a 4th behavior for anyone who's at the higher levels, and that's hire and develop the best. And you can see in this grid that we have our 4 different levels, and we've outlined that a level 1 should meet simple commitments, and level 2 should manage difficult goals, and level 3 is complex, and level 4 is highly complex. You can also look at time horizon. So what time horizon should that level be thinking of? And level 1 might be looking at just that day, and level 4 might be looking at 6 to 12 months out. So on the back of your sheet, you have a list of 4 different levels. Brainstorm within your organization what those levels might equate to. What are the jobs that are within those levels? And what are your expectations by level? And then we'll come back. And so that is one way to describe the difference between the levels based on the behavior. Finally, you need to develop your grading rubric. And this is something that you're going to pass out to your team once they're trained on behavioral-based interviewing. It's going to have the question, it's going to have the leadership principle, and it's going to have 3 different columns: does not meet expectations, meets expectations, and exceeds expectations. And within each of those buckets, it should provide a description of what would classify as that rating. And so, for example, in this example, we're looking at build strong relationships, fostering a positive learning environment through teamwork, communication, and collaboration with colleagues, parents, and the community. Our question is, give an example of a time when you were part of a team that had to work together in order to accomplish a goal. And of course, there are follow-up questions after that. If the candidate could not provide a relevant example, did not reflect on learnings, or could not show a focus on relationships, they do not meet the expectations. If they do provide a relevant example, properly reflect on the learnings, and express a focus on relationships, they will meet expectations. And if the example shows significant depth, expresses deep learnings, and emphasizes the importance of relationships, they will exceed expectations. Now, obviously, all of this is somewhat subjective, but as you get more people involved in this process, you will become more scientific. And part of the behavioral-based interviewing process is allowing people to have one-on-one interviews with the candidate. The candidate might have 2 to 3 one-to-one interviews. And those individuals who interview the candidate will write down their notes, write down their vote, and then debrief on the candidate. And that's where we get a lot of different viewpoints, a diversity of viewpoints into the interview process, and it becomes more scientific. Now, before you go off on your journey of behavioral-based interviewing, just remember, many candidates have never done a behavioral-based interview. Be patient. Ask follow-up questions. Encourage them in a positive way. You want the candidate coming away from this interview, regardless of the outcome, with a really high viewpoint of your organization. Well, that is the end of our formal presentation on behavioral-based interviewing. I will open it up to any questions that you might have.